With narcissism, this is a term that I feel like out of every word that could get tossed around in the world more loosely and recklessly, there isn't another word, especially another psychological word. How do
Yeah.
you, how do you as an expert reconcile what you know with what you see in the mainstream? Where are some of those differences, and can you kind of clarify where people may be wrong, getting things wrong?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting question, and I even see it changing now where people are throwing out narcissism in these different variants that are it's kind of this weird pathological, vulnerable, schizoaffective narcissism. I'm like, dude, I don't know where you're people are using the word a lot.
Yeah.
So the term narcissism, of course, it comes from the myth of Narcissus, which was a Greek myth, but mostly we think of the Roman retelling where he falls in love with himself and dies. And there's this sort of the story of, well, if you love yourself too much, you can't really connect to other people, and you're going to end up with some suffering involved, and there's some other morals. And so that term narcissism got adopted into the medical literature back in the, I think it's back in the 1700s at first, and then more in the 1800s with sort of Freud and Havelock Ellis. And it basically referred to people with an ego. So sort of an ego that's maybe gets you in trouble. And as the field, over literally these are centuries, over a century as people started looking at narcissism and thinking about it and how we thought about psychology changed, it ended up breaking into three basic kind of definitions of narcissism, which I can go over very quickly.
Yeah.
The first thing to remember, to think about, is you can talk about narcissism as a disorder, a personality disorder, a clinical or psychiatric disorder, which is narcissistic personality disorder. And that is extreme and has clinically significant impairment, which means somebody with a license to make these decisions has to say, Keith, your ego is so big, it's messing you up so much, I need to treat you for it. So that is relatively rare. 1-2% of the population at any given time has this extreme disorder. So we have this personality disorder, but we also think of narcissism as a trait. And what a personality trait is it's a consistent pattern of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors across time and situation. So if I'm extroverted, I'll be extroverted on your podcast. I'll be extroverted when I go out for drinks tonight. I'll be extroverted tomorrow. So across time and across situations. The other thing about traits is they go on a continuum or spectrum that looks a bit like a normal distribution or a bell curve. And so with a trait like narcissism, what that means is most of us are somewhere in the middle. We've got a little bit of narcissism to survive, but not so much that, it ruins our relationships. And some people have very high levels and some have low levels. So there is this normal individual difference in narcissism, which, again, high sense of self-worth, high self-esteem, need for admiration from other people, lack or sort of a general lack of empathy or warmth or caring. Not psychopathic necessarily, but not as interested in that. So most of us vary along this personality trait of narcissism, but to make it complicated, there are actually two personality traits which we call narcissism. And they've been around for 150 years, and about 20 years ago, we kind of separated them. One of the forms of narcissism, which most people in the audience are familiar with, is what we call grandiose narcissism. Extroverted, agenic, energized, positive emotion sometimes, plus a sense of entitlement, a lack of warm interpersonal relationships, self-centeredness, bragging, drawing attention to yourself, all that. So the classic narcissist you think of as, it's the politician I voted for. It's my last relationship partner that sucked. It's the surgeon that, wouldn't talk to me when he did surgery on me. It's those it's the celebrity.
Yeah.
It's Iron Man and Tony Stark. It's kind of this big personalities, energetic, often with this grandiose narcissism. When we meet people like this, we really like them at first, at least initially. And then over time, you're like, they don't really care about me. There's not a lot of warmth. They're looking out for number one. Maybe it's not good to have a relationship. So that's this more grandiose phase. And then there's this other face of narcissism, which we call vulnerable narcissism, or hidden or covert or shy. And this is that same sense of I'm important, I have a sense of entitlement, I'm better than other people, people should recognize my achievements. But instead of having extroversion, you have neuroticism that goes with that. I'm insecure, people don't pay enough attention to me, I'm not out there dating. And so what happens, in a weird way, being a grandiose narcissist kind of works in our culture. You can kind of go out there, draw attention to yourself. If you're attractive, you can kind of make it work. You'll hurt some people. Vulnerable narcissism, you're not really as active. So what happens is you end up, we sort of say in your basement, mom's basement, stewing about like, no one appreciates me, no one gets me. And people with that personality configuration often end up in therapy for something like depression or anxiety. So you end up in therapy for depression, and your therapist is talking to you and like, wait a second, you think you're a really big deal.
Yeah.
Your problem is you think people secretly don't recognize what a big deal you are. And that's that more vulnerable narcissism. Sometimes people use the word covert to describe that form of narcissism because it's a little more hidden. You don't really see it with people. It often looks like maybe depression or standoffishness at first. So, to answer your question, it's very confusing. We have a narcissistic personality disorder, and then we have two versions or two faces of a narcissistic trait, a more grandiose, in-your-face celebrity version, and a more sort of therapeutic, saying mean stuff online with a, hidden name, vulnerable form of narcissism.
Yeah. Is there an etiology or a set of symptoms or causes that we're aware of that one in general, is there anything in general that we know can tie to these to the disorder or the trait? And then more specifically, is there something that might push you from trait narcissism into full-blown narcissistic personality disorder?
Yeah. That's a good question. So, in terms of what shapes our personality traits, like narcissism, like most other traits, it's a pretty good dose of genetics we get from our, biological parents. That's about 40-50%. It's hard to look at these as just cutting a pie up, but just generally you just think, about 40-50% genetic. And then maybe 10-20% seems to do with actual parenting. But parenting doesn't make that big of a difference. So this is what we always run into in psychology is parenting doesn't, parents can't really change their kids too much. They can damage them, but it's hard for them to take a kid who's really extroverted and make them introverted, or take a kid who's kind of meek and make them into a champion, or what. It's hard to really, move people around that much. So what you see with parenting is it has a relatively small effect. With grandiose narcissists, sometimes they describe their parents as permissive. Maybe their parents put them on a pedestal. They were a golden child, sort of, because what a narcissistic parent sometimes will do is say, hey, I need to get narcissistic supply. I need people to think I'm a big deal. I'm not a big deal, but my kid could be a big deal. So I'm like, look at my child. She's the best. That means I'm good. So you use your kid as a prop to get attention. Yeah. And so that's sometimes reported as, this is really hard on a kid, because when it happens when you're young, sometimes it seems really positive, like, oh, my dad loves me. And then later you go, oh, that wasn't love. That was something else. And there's a lot of suffering. But with grandiose narcissism, you hear a little bit of that more permissive pedestal style, you're a special child. And with vulnerable narcissism, it's more the classic kind of cold parenting, ignoring you, abuse, lack of love. So it goes a little more the other direction. And with narcissistic personality disorder, if you think about it conceptually, what happens is if you're narcissistic a little bit at the right time, it's fine. But if you're narcissistic all the time, it's hard. So if I'm doing podcasts all the time, I'm like, hey, look at me, talk about my books. Like, hey, I'm going to sell books. It'd be great. If I act that way with my daughter, my kids aren't going to like me anymore. They're going to be like, my dad's kind of a dick and make fun of me. So when your personality gets stuck, it can cause problems. So what causes your personality kind of get stuck? One possibility is, trauma. You grow up with like a high load of trauma growing up, and, kids nowadays, like everything's trauma, but you think of sexual assault, violence in the family, parents, early divorce, leave you, lack of love.
Would this be like something that's on the ACE, the adverse childhood events kind of thing? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So any of those kind of things, you think about, and so here's what you see is childhood trauma does not predict narcissistic personality disorder specifically, but it predicts the odds of having a personality disorder. So my guess is, and this is a guess because I don't have the big enough data to capture these small things, is you have you're wired up to be a little narcissistic, but you add some trauma there, so it's harder to be flexible, and it's harder for you to connect with other people, and the narcissism gets away from you.
Yeah, I don't know if this is... I don't know if this is no, you're fine. I don't know if this is in your scope at all, but is this something that might have like an epigenetic factor where it's kind of like the stress diathesis model, where we have a genetic predisposition, and then when a stressor comes along the way, it may or may not activate that disposition? Or is that maybe something that is less specific to narcissism?
That's a very interesting question. From what I know about a lot of those epigenetic stress models is that they're not super stable, but often they do have to, but there are some models, and this is just from people I've worked with, not from my own, just talking to people who do this kind of stuff. There are models of psychopathy where you have maybe certain patterns of behavior and you have an early, maybe a stressed environment or I forget the word, like an empty environment, and that triggers maybe you to become more psychopathic, more self-centered because you had to survive in that environment, sort of like attachment. Right. So I could imagine a model like that happening with narcissism, but I don't have a model to give you that anyone I've seen published.
Sure.
And I'm always a little skeptical of the epigenetic findings now because a lot of, especially with the single gene stuff, it's just that a lot of those findings haven't seemed to stabilize.
Right.
Too well.
Especially across generations, right?
Oh, yeah. And when you start going the full on, like, well, my great grandfather, when they came over from Ireland, they were starving. And now I'm kind of a narcissistic guy because I'm trying to find, potatoes and I hate the British. Like that model, like it kind of makes sense, but I just don't know if the data are strong enough to support it.
I don't think it does, but yeah, that's maybe a whole other conversation.
It's an interesting model though, right?
Yeah. But I mean, it is fascinating to think about the adaptive qualities that narcissism may bring to the table at a certain phase in life that later become maladaptive.
Yeah, absolutely. So my way of thinking about most personality traits are as trade-offs. People are like, there's good and bad. I'm like, you can have both. Like I'm very extroverted. That can be a problem. It can lead me into problems. I take risks. That can do good stuff or bad stuff. And narcissism is the same, being sort of self-centered and self-focused. Maybe when you're 18, 20 years old, you're trying to date, you're trying to get a job in New York City, maybe a little narcissism is going to help you, maybe. And we do see it more we do see narcissism more in young men, grandiosity a little more in men than women. You see it more in, 18, 20 than you do in 40, 50. So I think there could be some adaptive benefits at younger ages. But when you get older and you're sort of forming families or groups, the narcissism can be more destructive because narcissism makes it hard to form close relationships.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of some of the ideas around like the dual inheritance theory, gene culture coevolution, the way that culture kind of acts as a proxy for biological adaptive behavior. Do you think, given, that kind of framing, that the culture as we have it promotes or allows narcissism in a way that it might not previously? For example, earlier you said it can work to be a narcissist in this world, you know what I mean? Like, but would we maybe see less prevalence if culture shifted?
Yeah, so that's great. So like the classic hunter-gatherer models, you're living in a small group of people and everyone has to share and people can't be too selfish. And if you read the old, like the immediate return hunter-gatherer literature, there's a lot of murders. But a lot of times what would happen is somebody would get really selfish. Maybe they, maybe there's rape, maybe they're stealing food, maybe they're not sharing. And what happens to people like that in the tribe is they get killed. They'll say, hey, everyone, Keith's kind of a jerk. Hey, Keith's brothers, go take Keith hunting, and Keith isn't coming back. So there'd be a hunting accident. Keith would end up with a spear in his back, and the problem would be solved. So we had this way of sort of keeping narcissism quelled in a lot of our early societies. As societies got bigger, that got harder to do. So there's, but you can imagine a time if you had a society and everything broke down, well, the people who are narcissistic are going to survive. They're going to take resources. They're going to make it work. So you can see there'd be certain times it would be adaptive, potentially. I mean, it's all just so stories. Well, you imagine a society where narcissism doesn't work. It's where you can't really lie about yourself because everyone knows you really well. Everyone knows your skills and abilities, and you need to work collectively with teams to solve things. So if I'm in an Amish farming community doing barn raisins, narcissism is not going to be it's not going to be a great trait. They're going to want somebody who's moral and a hard worker but I moved to LA, or moved to Manhattan or whatever, and I'm a new kid there and no one knows anybody. And I just have to go tell my story and sort of promote myself and make myself a member of that kind of modern culture. Being self-promoting, being narcissistic is going to be an advantage to me, especially early. Once I'm in the system, if I'm taking advantage of people, people won't want me around. But early in the system, I think it can be an advantage. And what we're seeing with some of the cultural work is narcissism going up potentially in China, and that seems to be associated with urbanization, smaller families, some of the economic changes. And in the US, I mean, when we really looked at narcissism, it looked like grandiose. Narcissism went up a lot until really seemed to slow in like 08, 09, 010 after the great financial crisis. And now I think we're seeing a lot more vulnerable narcissism, but I don't have good data on that.
Yeah.
It's just kind of when I look around, I see the ego, but it's a lot more fear. It's not so much look at me, I'm awesome. It's more you're bad, and it's more fear-based.
Yeah. Can we touch on that for a second? Because
sure.
Yeah, I know you and Gene Twenge had had kind of the landmark study in 2009 about the rise in narcissism. And then I think, what was it, in 2021, there was the Ego's Deflating piece that came out and basically said maybe because of economic challenges since 2008, there might be a lessened amount of narcissism. And I got to be honest, when I saw that report of lessened narcissism, I was kind of like, I'm going to call bullshit a little bit. Yeah, like, and I'm wondering, I guess, how you reconcile what I think feels like to most people right now a massive increase in narcissism, probably prompted and amplified by things like social media and the culture that we have, with the data that you're finding in this Ego's Deflating research.
Yeah, thank you for calling bullshit on my research. I appreciate that. I mean, I'm so sick of fake science. Yeah, dude, I'm doing my best, and I
love the work. I just, but it's my intuition.
No, that's the point of, we're supposed to call bullshit each other and have conversations. That's how science works. That's what makes it fun. It's a really interesting question. So we wrote a book called The Narcissism Epidemic, probably 12, 13, 14 years ago.
Fantastic book, by the way.
Gene Twenge, thank you. Gene Twenge and I, we spent a lot of time on that and really focused a lot on the cultural piece. Not so much on like this personality going up or down, but our baby names becoming more unique, our book titles changing, our houses becoming bigger with more unique rooms. So it's kind of looking around, vanity, social media, all that stuff to see if the culture is sort of expanding for narcissism. And it seems like the culture is definitely becoming more individualistic, more atomized, more narcissistic. When you looked at the individuals, it was going up from the 80s. And then again, like the paper says, it looks like in that crash, things started to change. If we're getting nerdy here, I was talking to Emily Bianchi, who's at Emory now, but she said she was at Harvard and noticed it when the job market crashed with a lot, before the crash, people were all pumped. And then after the crash, people became less positive about themselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think there's reason to see that. And then I'm going to say the other thing we started noticing is in about 2012, you start seeing depression and anxiety going up, especially for girls.
Mm-hmm.
And Gene has been looking at this a lot. And we looked at these data, and Gene will call, I mean, this is just, again, nerdy. Gene will say, like, Keith, I'm seeing this. I think it's social media. Find something else. Because I spend a lot of time reading economic stuff. So I'm always looking for, was it the gold standard? Was it this? Was it the, is it student debt? Like, I'm just trying to look for stuff. I'm like, I think the phones did something bad. And what I thought the phones would do is it would be a little bit like Ready Player One. I called it the Great Fantasy Migration. Everyone would be a big deal. We'd all be like, I'm a big deal. You're a big deal. We're all big deals. But it seems like what happened was we ended up with a lot of sort of intertribal competition, but also a lot of fear of missing out, social comparison effects where like, oh, you look so good and I don't look good, and you're in Dubai and I'm in Athens, Georgia, and I'm a loser. And so I feel bad, but I'm also self-centered. I'm like thinking about myself. And that's why I think the narcissism has a more vulnerable flavor to it. So instead of saying I'm in Dubai, I'm like, you're in Dubai. You should feel shame for all the carbon you use going to Dubai. You know what I mean? Like, I think it's a little different.
Yeah. Well, do you put any stock in communal narcissism as a measure, a valid measure? I know that's been since about 2012, I believe, that communal narcissism kind of came on the scene, and that's kind of what people might think of as moral grandstanding in philosophy or virtue signaling in kind of the common vernacular of the culture wars. Do you think that is maybe a thing that we shifted to, or a valid measure in general?
Oh, I do. So, dude, I'm doing full nerd stuff here. So when I first did it was Johann Gebauer, whose name I always mispronounce. Brilliant guy. And he was a postdoc in the UK at the time. And I remember him talking to me. He's like, yeah, I figured out this communal narcissism. And he thought I was going to be like he was like, thought I'd be pissed or something. I was like, dude, this is really interesting. And I've looked at some different data to try to figure out what it is. And it's so classic grandiose narcissism is like, I'm better than you, you, and you. And I'm the best. And communal narcissism is more like, I'm the nicest. I'm the best friend. I'm just more caring than you. You seem like you care, Steven, because, I saw you had a Prius, but, I have a Tesla that drives itself, so I don't even drive myself. So there's less carbon in my car than your car. And you're like, God, I feel bad. Why do I feel bad? And you seem nice, but you're making me seem bad, and you're acting. So, yeah, I think that's a real thing. Yeah. It's just kind of, but it's harder. It's a little harder to tease out. And, well, I'd say typically it's not as socially toxic, but it's a little different. So with grandiose narcissism, you might have a direct attack. With more communal narcissism, it might be more shaming people or ostracizing people. It's a more indirect way of harming people or showing superiority. Yeah. Like in the South, when people used to always say, like, when they bless his heart, like, that Keith, bless his heart. And that means that's something real bad. It's real bad when they say bless your heart. But they say it in a way that no one, if you weren't from the South, you'd be like, they're really nice to Keith. They're blessing his heart. And so I do see this, and I'd really love to get in and just kind of tease the data out and see what's going on. Because like you said, that moral grandstanding coming out of philosophy is really interesting. And those data work with some grandiose narcissism and some communal, but it's people like, look how when we were a kid, there was this character called the church lady on Saturday Night Live, who was sort of this hyper moral. And when I think of communal narcissism, that's what I think of, like, hey, how you doing, Steven? You hang with Satan, kind of like. So yeah, I see a lot more of it. It sort of has a pro-social face to it. It's like narcissism with a pro-social face. And I'm old school guy, and I can deal with old school narcissism. Some guy, I'm a big deal, check out my truck. I'm like, I can get along with those guys just fine. I just see it, I laugh, I get it. The other stuff is harder for me to see.
Yeah, it feels more insidious in a lot of ways. Yes. Because and kind of understandable, right? Because if you do enter into social media where your behavior is more tracked And we did kind of enter into this phase where it's like you buy organic food, you get the Prius. There is this shift towards, I think, finding meaning in a wealthy nation via being exemplary in your morals. And when you make that shift and then you bring it into social media where there is this high accountability, it feels like, all right, we're going to emotionally hijack each other. We're going to play on these evolutionary urges that say, all right, you know, if you're the piece of shit, we'll kick you out of the group. But we don't really know how to kick you out of the group for being too nice and making everyone feel guilty about being nice enough. But, you know, like you said, there's still maybe something behind the scenes there that has some insidious behavior that puts kind of people back, right? And maybe even in a sense where we don't really know how to engage with one another anymore.
Yeah, I agree. And again, I have to kind of tease this out myself because I'm kind of extroverted, old school. I like my narcissist sort of aggressive and in your face, and you know, kind of like
The vanilla narcissist.
I did a show with Jesse the Body Ventura, the wrestler, and it popped maybe before your time. And I was, and he's like, you know, Keith, people called me a little narcissistic back in the day. I'm like, really, Jesse the Body Ventura? I'm like, that kind of narcissism I can see. It's in your face. It's just kind of obvious what it is. And this more subtle form is just, like you said, insidious is a good word. It brings people down. It makes them feel ashamed. It makes people feel, and like, why am I feeling bad? It's like, you know, your carbon credits, man. You're like, what? Dude, who made you the carbon police, you know? But people got to work with what they have. And if you're in a society where you can't really show off because people will put you down, you got to do it the other way.
Yeah, very true. I want to jump back, if we can, briefly to that 2009, 2021 study. Something I was thinking about. We talked a little bit about genes and culture. And I'm thinking of Joseph Heinrich's work from Harvard, and he wrote Weird. So the book about Western educated, industrialized, rich, developed nations. And
good job on that, by the way.
Yeah, it took me a second.
I always mix one of them up.
Me too, usually. But it makes me think a lot of the work from the narcissism epidemic that y'all did was with 4 or 5 colleges, was it not? What was it? The data set had a large emphasis on.
Yes,
you know,
we had a lot. Well, there were a lot of UC data because there's just some. So what you're doing with this, what the method is, we want to see if personalities change. Well, ideally, somebody's been collecting these data in a standardized national data set for the last 100 years, but they haven't because they've only done that with like the General Social Survey. So what you do is find people who've collected these data. With narcissism, you go back to the 80s when it came out of like the Raskin stuff. That was out of Berkeley's University. Right. Berkeley had one of the big personality. It still does. Big personality centers back in the day. And so what happens is the data are biased from that because that, I shouldn't say biased, but that, I mean, not like it's a bias, but you've got a lot of data from there. And then Bob Emmons, who was doing a lot of the early narcissism work, moved to Davis. And started collecting a lot of Davis data. And then you go, well, culturally, Davis and Berkeley are like very different, but you would know that if you weren't like me, an 80s Berkeley grad from California. So there's a lot of weirdness in the older data sets because of just the quirks of where they come from. It's just, how do you work around that?
Well, and I guess my question maybe to that end a little bit is there a expression of narcissism that might fall out of the weird sample size, the sample group that could be different? For example, like I know with some pathologies, right, you wouldn't want to diagnose before like mid-20s typically, right? Because there's kind of a probably because of your brain not being fully developed and certain proclivities that you have as a result. But
and the channeling stuff,
So I don't know. I guess my question would then just be, do you think that having a kind of niche sample might be muddying the waters of how narcissism is being expressed?
Yes. So I would say the answer is absolutely yes. Having any niche sample is going to make your story a little more challenging. And what we try to do is you try to beat that by collecting lots and lots of samples. So that's sort of you just sample as much as you can. But when you start going back in time, that's just not possible. So you end up with a pretty dense measurement for a certain period of time, but you go, maybe it was different back then. And just to throw a monkey wrench in it, there was a study done from the Mill Valley colleges showing increasing narcissism among women. I think this was 70. And I could be wrong, 60s to 70s. And so what happened in those data, where it was during the women's liberation movement, and Mills Valley is a women's college, or was. I'm not sure their stats are now. And so what they captured were a lot of women becoming independent-minded. And so when they use those data, what you're capturing is something that looks like narcissism, but it also looks like autonomy and self-esteem and individualism. But that was sort of that's what's capturing women's rights.
Right.
So this stuff is tricky, and it's just tricky.
Makes me think of calling women who are on their period or having emotions like hysterical, right? Hysteria. Wasn't that a...
Oh, well, yeah, people give Freud a lot of grief, but the term hysteria, which we now have put into our academic lexicon as histrionic personality disorder, which looks a lot like narcissism. It's sort of extroversion and maybe some neediness. And I've only seen a few people like this. It's not as common. But the original idea was it came from your womb. So the Greek word for womb was hysteria. And then people are doing, you cut somebody's womb out to help you start thinking that insane stuff. And one of the things Freud did was say histrionism isn't really from your womb. It's like a mental, and so people give Freud a lot of problems, but he kind of figured out this early childhood trauma with his early seduction model. He buried it for political reasons he shouldn't have, but he figured out a lot of this stuff was psychological and not bio-based.
Yeah, he's a controversial figure, old Freud.
Dude, I love those guys. Great, interesting figure.
I was talking with some colleagues, friends about him and Jung the other day, and kind of saying, regardless of what you think about them, they're kind of like the giants whose shoulders we stand on. Their work was necessary even where it missed for, I think, us to kind of get where we are.
I think I would put William James in there as well. And he doesn't get his due quite as much. Even I think in Jung's biography, they took out the section on William James because I've just heard that I'm not a super Jungian. I'm like a closet Jungian.
Yeah. Was James controversial at all? It feels like he was kind of a monolithic figure.
He was, I'm trying to think, James controversially maybe using nitrous oxide for some of his mystical stuff, but no, he was really like a pragmatic American. I think he wasn't really, I don't think anyone hated him except he was a little weird.
Yeah.
But no one was like, damn you for giving up experimental work on frog legs and writing the varieties of mystical experience. Everybody's
got to, the really impressive thinker's got to be a little strange, right?
Yeah, and they also go from micro to macro. So Freud starts out working on squid neurons and synthesizing cocaine or coca, and then he ends up writing Civilization as Discontents about the nature of the world. And Jung starts out doing response time studies, and then he ends up writing, the Red Book or trying to bring back the Eleusinian mysteries into modern psych. These guys were awesome. You got to have people that are smarter than you, or else what's the point of waking up in the morning?
Somebody's got to play at the fringes, right?
Somebody's got to play at the fringes, man. Yeah.
I like one idea that is coming to mind. This is kind of a segue. It's a harsh one, so I apologize for that. But in your book, one of the things you mentioned that your most recent book is a colleague of yours, I believe, came up with the Great Fantasy Migration. And it was basically that a combination of high narcissism and low trust in the real world are causing people to want to move into virtual worlds more. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think I made that up. I usually make up I make up everything, and I always give my models silly names so no one takes them, tries to think they're mathematical models or something. So when I was a kid, I remember my parents took me to the Serengeti or the Masai Mara to watch the great wildebeest migration. And you see these, million wildebeest run and they cross a river and a gator gets them and it's just, and so that stuck with me. And I thought, well, we got all these people and the culture's dying. And what are you going to do with all these kids? Well, you got to get them, you got to take care of them, you got to control them, you got to get them online. So how do you get them online? Well, you don't want to pay them because that's expensive, so you use ego. Hey, go online, you get positive attention, you can connect. And so what I thought would happen was that people would start going online, getting esteem that way, kind of like an extension of the self-esteem movement. And then, hey, we raised you guys, we told you you're all winners, and guess what? You are winners. Keith, you're head of the Klingon Orc Guild in World of Warcraft 8. And Stephen, you run the Fantasy Football League, and you're one of the best tailbacks in the virtual league. And I'm like, we're all high-fiving each other. And so I thought the play would be, you got to control people. I thought the social control play would be to migrate people online and do it in sort of a very positive way. Another example, I remember being in Russia in the 90s, early 90s, when the ruble collapses, and they're like, you're going to get kidnapped. You got to hide. They hide us out in the stockhouse, and I'm in the basement eating caribou meat, watching Dallas on TV and the TV show Santa Barbara.
Wow.
So what happened to Russians is we started sending the shows like Dallas and Santa Barbara over there, and everybody's living, eating reindeer meat, watching this going, God, I want to live in Dallas. I don't want to be in Siberia anymore. This sucks. It's cold. And so I thought we'd do the same thing with people here, is just kind of, bring them online, give them a lot of status, for just kind of give them little tokens, just kind of make a big, this is a little bit like Walden 2, if you know what I'm talking about. Little Walden 2 vibe. I thought that would happen. And people did migrate online, and people spend a lot of time online, and they get a lot of status and esteem online, but it wasn't as clean as I wanted. I thought it would be clean, and instead, I knew there'd be a war because you always get two groups to fight. That's just how we work. But I thought it'd be a fun war. Like I like having frenemies. I like competition that's healthy and fun, and everyone has a beer afterwards. And it got a lot darker than that.
Yeah.
And a lot more hostile.
Do you feel like that is a result? Are you familiar with the term anomie from Durkheim?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I'm wondering if the real world's anomie, which would be, I think, defined as kind of a lack of clear standards, societal standards to understand what good norms to
and
adhere
meaning.
to.
Yeah, standards. I would say meaning too.
Do you think that this is my way to pretend that I made a really brilliant segue here? Do you think that maybe the discontent that Freud was speaking about in Civilization and Its Discontent, the anomie maybe of the real world, is what kind of pushed us into a more simple, rule-based, clear-cut set of norms that happens in the virtual space?
That is a great question. So I'm going to give you a long answer, and you
Please
asked
do.
for it. So I was hanging out with Roy Baumeister back in the 90s during my postdoc in his office over a lake in Cleveland, listening to jazz, talking about civilization as discontents.
Lovely.
And Roy said, here's how I see that book. The problem with society is that if we do what we want, society falls apart. If we live based on our id instincts, if we're sleeping around, we're eating what we want, we're not working, society falls apart. So the sacrifice we make to have a society is we have to have an ego, superego, an internalized and kind of hostile and harsh representation of our parents or society to keep us in check. Mm-hmm. So he said Freud's basic motto was, that's our discontent. We have to suffer with the superego to survive. So then you go, okay, well, that makes sense. And for a superego to work, you need a very structured meaning system. This is right, this is wrong, and everything's got to line up. So this is right and wrong, and the church says this is right and wrong, and the books say this is right and wrong, and the military says this, and education, and we all kind of go through that system, right? And then when we broke up the right and wrong system, Freud stuff is very Victorian. When we broke that in the 60s, the superego started going away. And this is I'm going back to Baumeister because I'm really nerding out here. Roy said, you should read this book by, I think it was Alan Wheelis, on the superego, Wheelis. It's a wonderful book about a kid who had to develop a superego by cutting his grass by hand. His dad gave him a straight razor and said, cut the lawn by hand. All the kids are playing. You got to develop it, your superego. And so Roy was lamenting the collapse of the superego in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
So once the superego falls apart and it's like, hey, Keith, you're awesome. Do what you want to feel good, which was kind of the 60s. If it feels good, do it. And then the self-esteem movement, which was... So the 60s, what happened is we said, if you feel good, do it. But everyone neglected their kids. So kids born late 70s, early 80s, we see this real drop in self-esteem. And this is my, kind of latchkey kids, like, because all the parents are finding themselves. So the Gen X is kind of born like low self-esteem, whatever. And then the boomers were like, oh no, the kids don't have self-esteem. Like, I was fine. I had a pretty interesting life. I just didn't like myself. They said, we're going to have the self-esteem movement. And this started by a guy, Vasconcelos, in California in the 70s, 80s. He's friends with my dad. He was a humanistic, kind of interest was humanistic psychology. And he thought, well, if we get Rogerian self-esteem into kids, they'll grow and develop and they won't have sex before they're married, kids out of wedlock, and they won't use drugs. And so... the psychologist said, or the educator said, that's great. The way we're going to do it is tell kids they're special and unique, and we're going to raise grades. And so we had this big, the self-esteem movement to kind of pump self-esteem into kids. And this is a lot of the narcissism epidemic. When we did that, we raised everybody's self-esteem, but we didn't make reality any better. So it was like... That's where the great fantasy migration is. If we raise everyone's self-esteem and expectations, but we don't change reality, they're screwed, right?
Right.
So you have these kids with high expectations. And so I thought, well, that's when you just take them all online and tell them they're the, Klingon Lord, and they'll be happy. And what happened, I think, is more that sense of like, oh my God, I think I'm a big deal. I'm not a big deal. And all the institutions around me that I'm supposed to look for advice are collapsing. I mean, trust in institutions has been collapsing since the 70s and really bad in the 90s. And before Afghanistan, people trusted the military. Now they don't trust the military anymore. It's a disaster. So you go, so kids go, where do I look for meaning? Well, the institutions have collapsed. I can move online, but I can't get a bunch of esteem there. People are going to tell me I'm ugly or something, or I'm going to see somebody who's got abs. I'm going to feel depressed. So you end up with a lot of like despair and people just kind of moving back. And so what you're supposed to do when there's no meaning philosophically is you roll into existentialism. Action precedes essence. You go, I got to go make reality. So I got to go build something. Right. And so you go to 1950s, or, I'm even forgetting my Sartre, if that was, I guess it was post-war, right? 1950s. I think so.
You say Sartre? Yeah.
Yeah. So Camus, you start reading Camus and you're like, I got to start just building my reality. Mm-hmm. But I haven't seen that happen yet. I haven't seen the existentialism make a comeback, and instead it's more like everyone's asking for help and caregiving and stuff.
Well, I wonder too, you mentioned something there, Jonathan Haidt talks a lot about the issues with kids these days not really having the latchkey experience. He works with, what's her name from New York? She does the Let Grow movement, but Lenore something, but
it's like the free range kids.
Exactly. Yeah. And I guess my point there is part of the issue we may find ourselves in is making meaning feels kind of like an anti-fragile, stress inducing task. And if you haven't cultivated that as a youth, it feels like it'd be a very difficult thing to persist through. Right.
Oh, absolutely. Because, if you're not, so the way we evolved is you're supposed to have a certain amount of stressors, enough to evolve, but not enough to kill you. Right. And so if you're growing pot plants in your basement, you put a fan on them, because if you don't have a fan, they're just going to wilt. And if you raise a calf and don't let it walk around, it's going to turn into veal, just soft and food. And so the challenge as a parent is like, how do you put your kid in the face of risks that are serious and consequential, but aren't going to kill them?
Right.
Because you only got one kid or you only got two kids. If you had 13, it would be easy because you just lose one or two, but it'd be fine. And then you go, I really got to protect my kids, and there's all this anxiety, and I don't trust the world. And so what happens is you end up raising a generation of people who haven't been exposed to risk, and they become very weak.
Yeah. Does that connect to narcissism at all for you? I mean, for me, I grew up skateboarding, and one of the things, I had a friend who tried to skateboard with me, and he was very stiff and was terrified of falling, and he ended up quitting because he was so afraid of the pain. But for me, I've busted my ass so many times, and I think part of the reason with humility, I will say I think I'm relatively grounded and not very narcissistic, and I think part of that is because I've had the shit kicked out of me time and time again, failing, and that I build a model around failing as the way to progress.
And coming back.
Yeah, and exactly. And so do you think maybe there is some connection there between getting your ass kicked in the real world and persevering and narcissism?
Absolutely. I don't have data for this, but when I think, I wish I did, like, did you have adversity and that kind of thing? Because you could maybe, it's going to be a self-report, so the data would be tough. What I like to think about are natural consequences. So I can tell my kid, you suck, and all my kid's going to do is, I hate you. That kind of consequence isn't going to work. But I can take my kid to a skate park and say, go in that half pipe, and she falls and breaks her wrist. Like, that's a natural consequence. Mm-hmm. But she's not mad at me because nature did that. She did it to herself. And so if you grow up in an environment where you get natural feedback, natural, like from nature, from your own behavior, there's no one you can point to. It's like the Taoists, like getting hit by an empty boat. You can't yell at a captain. And so what happens is I think you end up building a much more stable kind of model of yourself. I know my limits. I know my not limits. I know what makes me confident. I know where I'm not confident. I know where I get hurt. So I skateboarded when I was a kid, and I got hurt a lot. And I surf. Because surfing, you don't get hurt as much. People think it's more dangerous, but skateboarding, it's much more dangerous than surfing. Occasionally something will happen. But I'm a big believer in those natural consequences. And you talk to big wave surfers, you talk to fighters, you talk to people who go out there in the real world. They don't have egos. Mm-hmm. They're just grateful. I generally find, and I always say this, if I hang out with a bunch of very successful guys, like high status guys, not one guy is going to say I'm an alpha male. Like like if some guy's like, yeah, I'm an alpha male, every other guy knows he's a loser. Yeah. It's just because so there's this weird mix of, if you really go out in the world and mix it up with life, you end up getting good. So you build a lot of honest confidence, but you also build a lot of humility at the same time. That's why when you said, you want to call bullshit on my research, I was happy. Because if you do research like this, if you go out there and just kind of wrestle with the world and people are like, you're an idiot, you're like, yeah, maybe I am. Let's see. Yeah. You get, I'm pretty humble because I've been wrong a lot, but I'm pretty confident too because I know I've been right a lot in a real context.
You learn how to improve your model of the world by failing. Yes. As simple as that, right? You can't, and there's a lot of evidence to support this with, I think, the way Sapolsky's work on the magic of maybe with dopamine, like increasing your desire to be in novel environments where you don't have reliable information, because being in a situation where you
rush.
Yeah, exactly. It's the flow state, right? And there's a lot to be said for being on the edge of chaos, and what we can learn from that.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in that. So people go, people, they have this model like, I need to think I'm a legend to go do something legendary. I'm like, that's not how the hero's journey works. Hercules wasn't a hero. Hercules had challenges. He had to go clean the stalls and go get a fawn and do these other things. Yep. And then he became a hero by doing the hard work. But he didn't start a hero.
Yep.
And so when people are like, I don't have the confidence to do that, dude, I don't have the confidence to do anything. I'm scared every fucking day. But I'm willing to give it a shot.
Yep.
And I'm willing to say, you know what, you win some, you lose some. And after you do that enough, I mean, I've failed enough and succeeded enough. It doesn't hurt like it used to. You know, it's like first time you get rejected dating, it really sucks. And the second time it sucks. And the fifth time it sucks. But the sixth time, maybe not as bad. You know?
Yeah,
it's
I've been
like
here before, yeah.
Yeah, dude, this is how it works. There's a process. And so, you know, I'm not a real high self-esteem guy, but I'm willing to give things a shot. And I think you have just an attitude of willing to engage with the world will naturally lead you to have honest self-confidence and self-esteem if you're willing to engage.
Yeah.
And you don't have to think you're great. You don't have to think the world's going to tell you how you are.
Yeah.
And so I like what you're saying a lot. I mean, that's, yeah.
Yeah, I think there's something to it. Man, I'm loving the hell of this conversation, but I want to respect your time and put a ribbon on it here shortly. So given kind of what we've talked about here, given your expertise, given what you have seen in the world with the way that, I mean, I think you even call it an audience in your pocket with the smartphone in terms of like a narcissist's, you know, toy that the phone pretty much is a wormhole right there, ready for you to express your narcissism. How do you feel like we kind of are where are we right now in terms of psychopathologies, in terms of personality disorders, in terms of our relationship with our technology? When you look at the world, what are you feeling right now?
That's a good question. And I'm just being honest, fuck it.
Please do.
I think we let this technology get out of hand for young kids. I don't think it should happen. I think we should dial it back. And believe me, I am not the guy. I'm a deadhead who went to Berkeley and grew up in Laguna, and I don't tell anybody to do anything. I know nothing. But with children, I think this stuff might not be great. And I think any efforts to get rid of those damn phones out of schools, out of whatever, I think is going to be helpful. And I can't believe I'm saying that. Like, I'm not even like, when they like ban smoking, I'm like, come on, let them smoke. You know, I'm like, no, this doesn't seem real good. This doesn't seem good to me. So I don't think that's going really well. When I look at the world, I see here's what I see. I'll just tell you what I see. All the institutions have collapsed. You might not see it, but academia is in free fall right now. The military is obviously in free fall. Politics have already fallen. Journalism, we don't even have journalism really. And so all the institutions have collapsed. So what's taken its place now are individuals and networks. So instead of me going, what does the CDC say, or what does the University of California say, I call it my buddy at the CDC, you know, call it my buddy at the University of California, say, hey, what do you see? Mm-hmm. So it's gone from trusting institutions to trusting individuals. And so what you're seeing now is somebody like Taylor Swift is probably more powerful than Warner Brothers. You know what I mean? It's just wild. So that's going to destabilize everything because the institutions don't want to give up power.
Right.
Because why would they? So we're going to have this massive destabilization going on right now. And you ask me, I kind of think we're in the dark ages. I kind of feel people are getting dumber and dumber and dumber. And it's very hard to explain, except when I started, I was a terrible student. I had a 2.5. I didn't have a 2.5 GPA at Berkeley because I would be lying. It was a 2.47. I just read a lot of books.
Yep.
And I like to talk to people and read books. And I think when I talk to the older academics from the previous, they're like, dude, you guys work too much. All we did was just read books and talk and write 1 or 2 papers. And now it's a very, it's a management gig. And I just
Publish or perish.
And, I can play that game. I know it, but there's just not the depth of thinking we're seeing. Right. And I really miss that. And one of the areas of research I have, like my sub areas, is I study ayahuasca and shamanic medicine, just because I spent a lot of time, hanging out with kind of indigenous people, surfing and fishing as a kid.
You're a Berkeley skateboarder.
I'm a Berkeley skateboarder,
Experiment
right?
with your consciousness a little bit.
Yeah. Deadhead from back in the day. So I was always interested in this stuff. And so I look at that area. I'm like, well, this is literally the most interesting research there is. And it's just being trampled on. And I'm just I'm in shock that it's just being crushed. And so
I don't know if you saw Tanani's integrated information theory is just getting hammered right now because of that paper that just came out from 150 plus signatories. You basically called it pseudoscience. And I think it's important to mention that just because for people who might not know, Tanani, I can't remember how to pronounce it. He put forth a theory of consciousness that is extremely bold and is kind of, I think, what you're talking about, kind of a more ambitious, experimental, let's just be big thinkers. Yeah. And people just shit on it because a lot of neuroscientists were like, we don't like that this is getting attention in the media. And it kind of feels like the institution is holding back a little bit of audacity, but a lot of just inspiration.
I was actually talking about it with my students, and they said, what do you think? I said, dude, I think the theory is probably a little bit out there, but
sure.
Anybody calls something pseudoscience, I'm reading it.
Yeah.
Because there is pseudoscience is fake science. Proto-science is generating hypotheses that might be testable someday. And a lot of things we study involving the mind are not testable. They're just not testable. We can think about them in little ways, but you just can't really do a lot of this stuff. So we need to be thinking a lot. And so when I saw that come out, it's exactly what I'm talking about. This is dark ages nonsense. Why aren't you guys having a frickin' beer and talking about the nature of consciousness and seeing what happens instead of pointing fingers? I mean, I would love to be called a pseudoscience because I just laugh.
The Streisand effect, it would make all your work very popular.
Plus it probably, it helped the theory a lot with the Streisand effect. But I don't like that. I think science is, I love science, but it's a very limited technique you use at the end of a process. And there's a lot of processing that goes on. And God, I hate when people go, I'm a scientist and you're not. I'm like, you're not any good, man. You didn't win. No one gave me the crown of Mr. Science. I don't know who you are, but I don't remember them handing that out to you. So it's a very, a lot of people have a lot of confidence and they're idiots. And that's a bad combination. I don't mind idiots who aren't confident, but confident idiots are not. So you asked me, I told you, my bottom line, I think we're going from institutions to individuals. That's going to be a real rough transition. And social media is helping it, but obviously they're going to try to put the finger on their scales to stop that process. And you get people calling people pseudoscientists, which kind of is a head scratcher to me.
Yeah.
Anyway, it reminds me of like when I was a kid, there was all these Russian experts that had never been to Russia or didn't know how to speak Russian.
Right.
And I feel like
they weren't the ones failing skateboarding, right? They're the ones reading, right?
They were reading, going to school, and having people telling them they're smart.
Yep.
And if they had just gone to Russia and got their ass kicked, they would have learned so much. But they're like, and so I'm a big believer in just mixing it up with the world. Like, my students were like, I was talking about ayahuasca, and the students were like, have you ever tried it? I'm like, dude, I've written like 3 papers on this. Yeah, I'm going to write 3 papers on shamanic medicine and not try it? Like, how would I know anything? But
I think a lot of people would, though, right? This day and age. I think that's the issue, right? Is we find a lot more people seeing the model from the written way rather than the experiential way is as equally
but the
as valid.
Model is not the terrain. The map is not the terrain.
Yep.
The finger is not the moon. I read a lot of Lao Tzu as a kid, and there was a line in the Tao Te Ching, something like, you need to still yourself in order to see life's secrets, but you need to engage with life in order to see its manifestations. And the two are the same and move forward from the Tao. And so my career, I've always tried to live and study, and it's always a little bit of a back and forth. And I'm not saying that's how you should do it. That's how I've done it. But like you're saying, I've been so wrong so many times in such a painful way. My ego isn't what it would have been if I just thought I was a big deal.
Right. I want to see if we can close with the alternative here a little bit. Do you see a path forward in any way, shape, or form, or even have a recommendation or a thought? Like, if somebody is like, I'm agreeing with Keith, this is a shit show, I don't like the way that things are going, I'm going to commit my energy to something that might be beneficial. Do you see a thing, an entity, an institution, anything at all that you're like, this could help us? If we did X, we might see even an inch of progress.
Oh yeah. So I talk to a lot of young kids, and I really like I love these Zoomer generation. I love these young guys and young women. I'm optimistic in a lot of ways. And the one thing I see as a problem is people go, well, what are you interested in? Well, I'm going to stop global warming. I go, okay. So what you need to do is make about 10 or 15 billion dollars. You need to start a business with China. You need to get some connection with Xi, and then you're going to have to work a deal. Okay? So you probably should be majoring in finance, because that's the only way you're going to have any effect. To major in finance, then get your $10 billion. I say, because no one listens to me. Like, the only way I have an effect is if I say something indirectly and somebody with power gets it and runs with it. And usually, I hate to say it now, but what I used to say is you have as much control over your ideas as a beach ball at a Jimmy Buffett concert. Rest in peace, my friend Jimmy. You don't really have that control. You're an academic. You put out your idea, and then people will run with it, and you can't stop them because they do stuff, and you're an academic. So when I talk to young people, I say, you know what? World's kind of falling apart in a lot of ways. You got to build your next reality and build something cool. So, hey, why don't you find some of your buddies? And, you're always complaining you can't afford real estate in town. Why don't you go to the next town, buy 4 houses together, set up a little band, and make that your town and do the cool stuff you want to do, And so I'm a big believer in entrepreneurship, risk-taking, building your own reality. I would love it if every young person I talk to was like, I'm just going to go hustle and build something great. Because I'm like, dude, I'm too old to build a future. I'm like running on fumes. I want you young kids to build something awesome so my grandchildren have a world. And I see a lot of people hustling to do that. It's hard to do it in the institutions. I see people trying it outside the institutions. Some of these things like, cryptocurrencies end up being a potential disaster. I don't know. Some of these things, people, it's experimental stuff. And you just hope, but I'm just like, you guys, please experiment and please do your own research. When people are like, oh, what are you going to do? Do your own research? Yes, do your own research. Go online, read papers. You're smarter than me. You can figure this stuff out. So do your own research, build your own stuff. Build the greatest life you want for yourself, and don't listen to all. Yeah,
it reminds me of another Eastern philosophy inspired quote. I think it was Jack Kornfield, a Buddhist teacher, who said, "Tend to the part of the garden that you can reach."
Well, that's a better quote than mine. Yeah,
I think I liked yours a lot.
Yeah, but you can do stuff, and you can do real. Like, I had the coolest freaking life. I've done it's not over yet, knock on wood, but I've done so much cool stuff. You just go do it. Mm-hmm. Just go get a group, have it. If I'm in Georgia, I was like, get 5 guys and get some kayaks and sail to the Atlantic go down one of these rivers. That would be bitching,
There you go.
Never done that. But if you did that, your life, if you did that instead of watching TV or watching Netflix for the next week, your life would be infinitely more interesting. Nope. Just little things like that.
Great. Go out and live. Keith, thank you so much for your time, man. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. That was really fun.